your enjoyment in the outdoors, especially in cold weather in the wintertime, really comes down to your clothing choices. And I like to use a layered system when it comes to clothing. And so really taking that layered approach to your clothing system is the way to go. And in the military, I learned an acronym that is called COLDER, C-O-L-D-E-R. And COLDER stands for clean. Obviously, you want to keep your clothing as clean as possible as you can when you're out in a field environment. O stands for overheating, which is something you want to avoid. Obviously, you want to avoid overheating. You don't want to sweat when you're out here in the cold weather. L is loose layers, so you want to actually dress in loose layers rather than tight layers. Those loose layers create that dead air space that you can kind of warm with your body heat, and it keeps it trapped up against there, so you'll be a lot more comfortable when you're out there. D stands for dry, which is obviously a great thing. You don't want to have evaporative cooling coming into the mix, and you really don't want to have wet clothing on, especially if wind comes through, because then you're really dealing with some convection that's going to sap your body heat as well. So dry. E stands for examine, and then that basically you're looking for rips, tears, holes in your clothing that kind of don't allow them to really perform the way you want them to perform when they're at their peak, when they're in good condition. And R stands for repair as needed. So if you find something like that, good idea to use the sewing kit or your bank line and sail needle to make those repairs as needed. So with that COLDER acronym, I like to take a layered approach to clothing, and I use basically a 4-layer system. I think of it as your base layers, which are kind of a wicking material because that's what's right against your skin. For base layers, I like to use a couple of different weights of, these are merino wool, these are from -33. So I have kind of a lightweight wool base layer, the bottoms and the tops. And that's kind of my minimum base layer that I'm going to put on. And I like to have merino wool because it's not scratchy, right up against my skin. It still has that wicking property, and it still does pretty well when it's wet if you compare it to cotton. So that's kind of my base layer. And then on top of that, you could maybe consider this an insulating layer, but it's still kind of a base layer. This is the Expedition weight, which is more of a heavyweight merino wool, also from -33. Sometimes I'll wear just the lightweights, sometimes I'll wear just the heavyweights. Most of the time, if I'm wearing the heavyweights, it's cold enough to where I'm also wearing the lightweights. So I kind of layer those together. Gives me a lot of different options depending on what the weather is out there, because the rule of thumb that you want to go with is you want to be comfortably cool when you're actually moving and working and doing things, but you want to be comfortably warm when you're kind of stationary. So that's kind of the rule of thumb that you want to keep in mind. So that layered system really allows you to shed or add layers to kind of keep within that principle, because the goal is not to sweat, because if you sweat, you die, in the words of Les Stroud. But that's kind of my base layers, a little bit of the insulating layers. And really after that, I want to think about insulating layers in the context of insulating my core, right? The legs are really not going to be all that cold. They can get cold. I've got those as that, but as far as like additional insulating layers for my upper body, my core, I like to have, kind of as a base, I'm wearing one right now. This is a Leicester River field shirt, and then I've also got a Leicester River wool anorak. Both of these are a heavier weight wool, so I consider them kind of an insulating layer to go on top of those base layers. But both of these are really good. This anorak style is just a pullover. This one's easier to get in and out of, which is kind of more of an everyday kind of thing that I like to use. So those are my first insulating layers. And then when it's really cold, or when I'm sitting around camp especially, what I like to have is a puffy jacket just to kind of add some additional insulation to my core. And it's not something that I would use when I'm moving most of the time. This is more of a camp comfort kind of item, but I do consider that part of the insulating layers. Now, from there, you basically need some sort of a shell. Where I'm at in the Northeast, most of the time we have what's called a wet snow, and that means that the snow is actually wet and sticky, and if it gets on you, it melts rather quickly, gets you soaked. And if you don't have a good outer layer, a good shell to protect you from that moisture and that wind, then chances are, even if you're wearing wool, cotton, doesn't matter what you're wearing, it's going to get wet and it's going to lose some of its insulated value. So I like to have a shell available for when it's wet out. kind of the modern approach to that is a Gore-Tex shell. These are both, this is an Arc'teryx shell, and I basically used a tan version of this when I was in the military, and I really was quite fond of it. I was actually a little upset when I had to turn it back in after I got out of the military. So this is naturally what I went to because I'd tested it in the field for so long. This is what I wanted for my shell layer. So that's kind of the one approach you can take to it, and that's the Gore-Tex jacket, and then a set of Gore-Tex pants or bibs to keep your legs dry. That's just a really good thing. These are also from Arc'teryx. Doesn't mean you have to get Arc'teryx, it's just the ones that I happen to use. So that's kind of the modern take on that. And really those are really, really good for conditions when you have wet snow, because that'll keep your wool and keep your other layers nice and dry. And then kind of in between that, we'll talk about this really quick. You know, the saying goes cotton kills. Well, cotton doesn't kill. Like the saying should be cotton kills if you get wet in cold weather and can't get dry, because I wear cotton clothes all the time and I live in the Northeast all winter long, and you know, to no really ill effect. But if I were to get wet, you know, cotton is going to absorb that moisture and it's going to stay there for a long time. So I don't like to have cotton against my skin, but I don't mind having it for what I call the durable layer, which is kind of the layer from your base layer. I like to use the merino wool, then kind of my durable layer, then insulating on top of that, and then a shell outside of that is kind of the concept. But what I call the durable layer is just durable clothing that I can walk around in the woods through the briars and not really worry about it getting all that torn up. So typically I'll wear just some pants. These are cotton pants, and I'll use like a cotton flannel shirt. And you know, cotton's not the best choice in cold weather, but it's not what's against my skin. I've got 2 layers of wool that's actually against my skin, that's wicking any moisture out. Then I have these, the cotton material's not in contact with my skin. And if it's wet out, I'm gonna have the shell layer to protect everything. So I don't really worry so much about cotton in cold weather. Now, if I didn't have base layers and I didn't have a shell, wearing cotton in the winter, not the best idea. So that's really kind of the rest of the story on the partial statement of cotton kills. And honestly, cotton kills in cold weather if you get wet and you can't get dry right after. But synthetics do the same thing. You know, if you get soaking wet in cold weather wearing synthetics and you can't get dry, you're still going to be cold. It's not going to be good. So any material that's wet in cold weather that you can't get dry is what's going to kill you. All right, so don't worry too much about your clothing selection, but I do recommend always having the wool against your skin. Testing, testing, testing. Nothing rhymes with testing. Testing, 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 rawhide. We're good? Now, kind of in keeping with that modern approach, you know, you still need to accessorize because you lose a lot of heat from your neck, you lose a lot of heat from your head, your hands are going to get cold really quickly, your feet, of course, which we'll talk all about footwear choices. But kind of keeping with that same thing, you know, having a nice wool hat, a beanie that you can put on is going to trap a lot of body heat. And then in addition to that, another accessory I definitely recommend is some sort of scarf, some sort of neck covering. And I like to use wool for that too, because again, it's something that's against my skin, but that traps a lot of heat here. It keeps the carotids and the jugulars warm. And then, you know, when we're talking about something like losing body heat through your respirations, when you actually breathe out, you're breathing out all that warm air that your body, it basically absorbed heat from your body, you're breathing that out, and then you're breathing back in super cold air. So your nasal passages and your oral passageway, that starts to warm it a little bit, then it's got to get in your lungs, and all of that starts sapping heat from your core. So if you have a scarf on in cold weather, kind of like when you take your hands and you blow into them and that hot breath really warms them up, like what I like to do with a scarf is when it's really cold is actually put that over my face, put that over my mouth, so that way it captures some of that warm air that goes out, so when I go back to rebreathe back through there, it sucks some of that warm air in, you know, so it kind of, it's less of a toll on my respiratory system to warm that air. So that's another thing that I like to use a scarf for. As far as gloves, you know, you've got kind of 2 different choices. You've got mittens or you've got actual gloves. And really, I kind of carry both. Mittens are going to be warmer than gloves, just because you kind of got all your digits in there close to each other, warming that whole thing, instead of, you know, each individual one is responsible for warming each individual finger of that glove. You got more dexterity with the gloves, so if you're doing things around the camp, like, that's really handy. But for the most part, mittens are always going to be the warmest option. And then another thing that I'll say, you know, in the wintertime is, in extreme cold conditions, the last thing you want to do is set one of these down and lose them. So you always want to have the ability to actually tie these off, so that when you take them off, you're never setting them down on the ground and walking away from them, getting covered with snow or losing them. You always want to maintain control of those. That's why most of my anoraks and jackets that I actually use in the wintertime actually have little hooks or something in the pocket to where I can hook those on, so if I take my glove off, I don't drop it on the ground and risk losing it. So that's an important consideration, is don't ever put your gloves on the ground and end up losing them. Gloves or mittens. So that's kind of a modern approach on that. I like the mittens because they're warm. I like fingered gloves, actual gloves that are lined and insulated. I like those for actual dexterity when I'm doing camp chores. So as far as keeping your feet warm and as dry as possible, you know, footwear plays a big role in it, but, you know, this is also something that's against my skin. So I like to wear wool socks. I really prefer alpaca wool because it just, they tend to make those a lot thicker, and it's just a really nice insulator. But, you know, regular sheep's wool is great. You know, these are all smart wool, but I like to kind of think of this is like a 3 is 1 and 1 is none kind of thing. Like, typically the footwear that I'm choosing for the wintertime is oversized 1.5 sizes or so. I want to be able to wear at least 2 to 3 pairs, depending on how cold it is, 2 to 3 pairs of wool socks, because these are all insulating layers. It's kind of like, imagine taking that 4-layered clothing system but applying it to your feet. I want several layers of wool between my feet and the boot and the boot and the ground. You know, well, I don't want wool between the boot and the ground, but you know what I mean. You want to have multiple layers on your feet as well. You know, there's not really too many socks out there that are thick enough in these extreme cold weather temperatures that you can rely on just one pair of socks. So when you're thinking about your winter boots are going to be quite a bit oversized. I think these boots that I have on are 1.5 to 2 sizes. I think these boots I have on are 1.5 to 2 sizes bigger. But basically, I take 3 pairs in when I'm going to buy them, take 3 pairs of wool socks that I'm going to wear, like I'm going to wear when I'm out in the field, and I try those on and make sure that they fit and they're not too tight. And that really gives me some really good camp insulation, especially when I'm just around camp. So that's kind of a modern approach on that layered system. And then, you know, I kind of like traditional gear when I'm out. I like to enjoy myself in the woods, and, you know, that means different things to different people. And for me, I really like using traditional gear, and I like to use gear that I actually made. So kind of a more traditional approach, more of a DIY approach, I'll show you the same thing, you know. So I'm still using the same base layers, and I'm still using the same durable layer, but for like my outer shell, and keep in mind this is more for like a dry cold, that's why I kind of need to have both options. For like a dry cold, which I've found to be around, you know, 20 degrees Fahrenheit and below, gets that nice dry crispiness, and it doesn't matter, the snow's not going to melt, it just kind of sloughs right off of you. Like, I'll use a more traditional outer layer that's just a really tight woven cotton because I'm not worried about it getting wet. These are some Canadian military surplus wind pants, and these are considered windproof pants, but they're a cotton polyester blend, super oversized, so I can put them on as my layer over all my other layers. I've got that nice dead air space. It keeps your legs nice and warm. Oversized buttons, really easy to use when you have gloves on still, so I just really like these as part of my outer layer for my legs. So then for the parka, it's basically an anorak that I made. This is from a kit from Lord of the North, my friends up in Canada. You would have saw Kylie on Alone season 6 maybe. But anyway, I had been getting stuff from them because they're up in Canada and they kind of know a thing or two about being in the cold. So this is a DIY kit that I bought. I sewed this up myself. So, you know, aside from being a functional piece of gear that looks pretty good, it's something that I did myself, and, you know, I really like that aspect of it. But this is just a really tight woven cotton. But again, this is something that I'd wear over everything as an outer layer to kind of break the wind. But of course, cotton's not waterproof. It's not treated at all. It's still very breathable. So it's a really great choice for dry, cold conditions. And that's why I really like this. It's a more traditional style. And that would go as my outer shell instead of the Gore-Tex for when the conditions allow for that. Actually, we'll talk about this. So this one, kind of in that traditional style, I like the wool beanie. It's really good. But I also like this one. This one I picked up from Alaskan Fur Trader, I believe it was. This is actually a coyote trapper's hat. And I like this one because it's big, furry, and fluffy. And I think we can all agree that it just looks really good, except for that part of his tail that's in my face. I think we can all agree it looks a lot better than the other one, but I can pull these down or I can fold them up and tie it up. So I kind of really like this. And it's extremely warm. It was probably warmer when it was still on the coyote's butt, but now it's on my head. Then you've got the beaver mittens that I made. You probably saw a video of this on YouTube, but these are bison hide and beaver fur. And then on the inside is actually a felted wool liner that I made. So I've got a layer of wool on there. And of course that fits inside here. So it gives me 2 layers. And these are extremely, extremely warm gloves. So you almost, unless it's really cold, you almost can't stand to wear them very long. But that's a good thing. Nice and tight. But these are, my Chewbacca gloves, as my daughters call them. But these are extremely warm, really great for extremely cold conditions. And I really like this. These are, again, something that I made. So that's a more traditional approach to keeping your hands warm. I got this metal plate running right here. If that gets dented, my hair is just not going to look right. All right, so kind of with the footwear choices, this is a big question that I get. If your feet are cold, you're going to be miserable no matter how warm the rest of your body is. So 2 different approaches. We talked a little bit about oversizing your boots. And really, I think of these muck boots, these are Arctic Pros. I think of them as kind of a more waterproof, water-resistant kind of muckluck. They're kind of a waterproof version of these, which are traditional mucklucks. So wet, cold conditions, again, when it's kind of sloppy snow, I don't want to wear a leather, moccasin lower because they're just going to get soaked, and then my socks are going to get soaked, and then I'm going to have cold feet. These have a rubber lower and neoprene on the side, so this is kind of like for wet snow. Then if the snow's dry enough, these are a much more comfortable boot. These are traditional mucklucks that I made, same kits, Lure of the North, same as the beaver mittens and the anorak. But there's really nothing better than a pair of moccasins, in my opinion, for walking in the woods. And if the conditions are right to where I can wear these in the wintertime, then that's great. They're great for snowshoeing. They're great for everything that I like to do in the wintertime. So these are both kind of oversized. So when I'm running around and I'm using, snowshoes, they're great. But if I'm hiking, the snow's not really deep enough to worry about or to actually use snowshoes, then, an insulated Gore-Tex hiking boot may be more your style. It's going to be a lot more comfortable. I don't really oversize these as much because I might be walking really far in the wilderness, and if I'm trying to do that in oversized boots, maybe it's not as good for walking, so maybe you use a pair of hiking boots. So those are kind of the choices. I typically use these around camp or when I'm using snowshoes. These are for wet conditions. These are for dry, cold conditions. And then if I'm doing some trek, I'm doing a lot of land nav, or I'm moving really far, then I'm going to use a pair of insulated Gore-Tex hiking boots. So that's kind of the clothing choices. And if you get your clothing right, you can spend a lot more time out in the forest in these kind of conditions. And it's going to be just as good as if you were in the spring or the summer. You're going to have a good time, and that's really the point. Is get off your couch and get out. Even though it's cold, enjoy yourself in the wilderness.
This tree is a symbol of the Griswold family Christmas. She'll see it later, Clark. Her eyes are frozen.